All right. So that lab was just for a review. It was really just practice. If you guys want me to go over the answers, I can. I just want you guys to get warmed up with writing some code. I know that like thinking mentally about writing stuff on paper is a little tricky. You're not allowed to have a keyboard in front of you. It gets a little difficult, but do your best. But I will go into for loops, and this is the only thing we're going to go over today. This is the technical description for a for loop. It basically is like it lets you define how a loop works way easier than, you have to do less work to make a loop than you normally would have to for a while. And there's like 4 parts to a for loop. The first part to a for loop is you're allowed to set a value initially. You're allowed to basically set some number at the start. In addition to setting a number at the start, you're allowed to test whether the loop should keep going. And then, after you've executed the loop action, which is just normally what a loop does, then you can update a number for the test. And it's weird. You have to have these kind of 4 things to make it work. And it's like, why would that be useful? But I'm going to show you an example of like what the code actually looks like here. So this is a standard C++ program. You should be able to recognize the cout and the variable declaration here. And that's the for loop here. Looks a little weird. There's a lot of parts to it. But in actuality, it's actually, the things that you have to learn here is you have to memorize which parts of the for loop do what. And I'm going to go over that right now. What the for loop actually does is the same exact thing as a while loop. This stuff inside the loop, this body here, repeats. So as an example here, this is a for loop that will loop 5 times. And this is what it does each time. So it will repeat this line 5 times. Okay? So let's break this down a little bit. What are the different parts of a for loop? This is stuff that you just have to memorize. This is just how the syntax works. You will write enough of these where this will become something you don't even have to think about. But they kind of go in order anyway, of how each piece is evaluated. So the first part of a for loop is, this is the syntax, is something called initialization. So that initialization is basically a line of code that you can write when your loop starts. It's a way to write a small snippet of code that lets you create data that you're going to use inside the loop. That line here only ever runs once. And the most common thing that you do is you create a variable and you set that variable to 0 to start. So looking at the previous example, the initialization here is this first part. It's just a line of code. It's not anything crazy. Literally, you can write any line of code you want in there. It just happens to be like right in between a parentheses and a semicolon, but literally anything that you want in there. You could even put a cout in there if you wanted to, but that would be silly. It wouldn't do anything. The idea is that the stuff here runs 1 time when the loop starts. And the reason why that's useful is because oftentimes when you're looping through something, you want to loop through something like 5 times. You can create a variable here. You have a variable called I. And I is a very common variable used for loops. Typically it's for index, stands for index. But you write it so often that you just shorten it to I. And all this thing does is it counts from 0 and goes all the way up to 5. That's all that variable does. So the first thing that we do is we set that variable to 0. Okay, so that's what that initialization statement does. It's a line of code that runs once, and you can do whatever you want to, but typically we set a variable. And typically that variable is set to some starting value of something like 0. The next part here is this test expression in the middle. This is exactly like what you normally write in a while loop. Okay? So think about how a while loop works. Think about what you write into the parentheses of a while loop, right? Let me just give you guys a refresher of what that is. Do you remember what this while loop is? It just has some condition. And as long as that condition is true, you keep looping, right? I guess I've used this enough and got asked a few questions about this on the test. So if this thing is true, go ahead and keep looping. It's exactly the same for the for loop. That right there, what you normally write in the while loop, is what you put here. Okay? That's just what that is. You put a condition here that you want that thing to keep looping as long as that thing is true. So if I go back to the code example, what is the, how often will this loop run? What is the expression here? As long as I is less than 5, go ahead and loop. If I were to do the same thing here, if I had a variable, it's exactly the same condition like that, right? Remember, this thing, as long as that's true, you'll go ahead and loop. Okay. So here, this for loop will run as long as this thing is true, which is as long as I is less than 5.
Is there a different way to do it a certain number of times, or is it just always going to be variable?
This is whatever you want this to be. This is a true or false statement. If that returns true, it will loop. If it returns false, it will stop looping. Okay. So I'm going to spend more time on this. So that middle thing is basically as long as that thing is true, go ahead and loop. Okay. This is the verbose description. You can ignore kind of last paragraph of this. This basically determines if it gets looped or not. In the case of the example, it loops as long as I is less than 5. And then finally, we have the last piece here, the update expression. So this is kind of what makes a for loop simple compared to using a while loop to do the same kind of work. This thing runs every time the loop repeats. So this is another line of code that runs every time the loop repeats. Typically, it's used to increase a counter variable. So here, look at this. What is going to happen every time that loop repeats? You add 1 to I. That's it. All right. So initialization, this runs once. This thing, as long as that's true, the loop will repeat. And this gets run every single time the loop restarts. So let's go over to the flow of what actually happens in a for loop. So here's a for loop. And here's the chart that happens when you're running a for loop. And remember, like this might seem like more complicated, more work than it's worth. Why don't I just use a while loop? But you write these things so often, and they're so useful for looping over things, that the fact that it does this for you makes writing code a lot easier. You could do the same amount of work. It's probably 2 or 3 times as much code to write a while loop that does exactly the same thing that for loop does in 1 line. Okay? That's why there's so much stuff going on in there. It's basically like kind of combining them all into one. Let's go over the step-by-step about what actually happens in this. So first thing is initialization happens. Remember, it happens once. So you enter the loop, initialization happens. The next thing that does, tests to see whether it should start looping or not. The first thing that it looks at is that test expression. Before it even goes into the loop, it sees if that thing is true or false. See here? If that thing is true, if I, in our case for our example, is less than 5, run the body of the loop. Run whatever code is in the body. That's the same thing as a loop body. It's whatever is within curly braces there. When you're done with that body and you're about to repeat the loop, that's when you run your update expression. Okay? So that's the order. Initialization, then you test, then you do the body, then you update. It seems backwards. You would expect it to do that whole line, right? You would expect it to do initialization, update expression, and then initialization, test expression, and then update expression, right? But it actually doesn't. It's kind of, this is what makes a for loop kind of funky. Thank you. So like, you would think it hit initialization, test expression, and then update. No, actually this is the order. Initialization, test expression, body, and then update. Okay? As soon as test expression is false, it exits the loop. Let's go through some examples of what actually, let's actually go through the code, and I'm going to step through some examples of how this works so we can do some practice. But does this make sense, like kind of like how it's supposed to work, like in theory? Let's see how it works in code in practice. All right.